The Wet'suwet'en Pipeline is a 670-kilometer, multi-billion-dollar pipeline running through British Columbia. 20 of the indigenous paying councils that the pipeline runs through signed off on the agreement. 5 of the 6 Wet'suwet'en band councils signed off on the agreement.
The hereditary chiefs of Wet'suwet'en, Yun Sutton, and Kaigenda Mohawk are all protesting against the pipelines. They are setting up blockades all across Canada, some even in Toronto. These protests are meant to get the government's attention as they are trying to ruin the traditional lifestyle of Indigenous people by affecting their resources and contaminating their land.
Our group has investigated various legal issues, including OPP and RCMP rights, jurisdiction, civil disobedience, significance of documents protecting Indigenous land and rights, as well as who is breaking rule of law.
Rule of law is the main legal issue being discussed. The Indigenous people feel that the government has broken rule of law by not consulting with them before starting the pipeline. This breaks rule of law by not giving Indigenous people their rights protected under the Indian Act. A similar situation occurred in Quebec when the Energy East pipeline was proposed. Quebec was opposed to the idea, and the Canadian government listened to them and didn't build the pipeline. Why is this not the same for Indigenous people? Rule of law was also broken when Justin Trudeau called RCMP onto Indigenous land without consent. Trudeau said himself he didn't have jurisdiction to call them. This is a violation of rule of law because nobody is above the law.
OPP are responsible for all of Ontario, and RCMP work at the federal level and are responsible for all of Canada. The OPP and RCMP have had history when a similar situation happened and an OPP officer shot an unarmed Indigenous man at a protest.
UNDRIP defines individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including their ownership rights to cultural and ceremonial expression, identity, language, employment, health, education, and other issues. This prohibits discrimination against Indigenous peoples. Indigenous land claims and UNDRIP both show and explain that Indigenous peoples are able to protect their cultural heritage. Also, few Indigenous nations ever sign deals so that land is still Indigenous land. In Article 31 of UNDRIP, there is a major emphasis that the Indigenous peoples will be able to protect their cultural heritage. British Columbia is not really following the rules of UNDRIP. They signed the declaration, but they're still trying to use the Wet'suwet'en land for the pipeline and ignoring Indigenous rights.
Civil disobedience involves deliberately breaking the law, so Indigenous people are having to protest, which is breaking the law on purpose, just to have a voice and be listened to. Then the government are arresting Indigenous people for standing up for themselves. This connects with Wet'suwet'en, as the hereditary chiefs of Wet'suwet'en are being arrested for fighting against the pipelines, as it is messing up their lifestyle. However, this is the only way they can be listened to, is being civilly disobedient. Solutions. There are a number of solutions that would solve the blockades and protests. One is that the government could consult and meet with Indigenous peoples and come up with a fair agreement for both sides and actually follow through with it. Another solution is the government could listen to the protesters and detour the pipeline so that they don't go through Indigenous territory. Last solution is that the government could offer Indigenous people money or some sort of resources in exchange for some of their land.